Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond the Launch, where it's all about making websites better. And to make a website better, you need to use the right tools. One such tool is Google Tag Manager. So in today's video, let's have a look at the why and how to get started with Google Tag Manager. We'll go through the 4 key components of Google Tag Manager in tags, triggers, variables, and data layer. So if you're just thinking about getting started with Google Tag Manager, this is the video for you. If you're already an experienced Google Tag Manager user, feel free to check out the video and let me know in the comments how you got started with GTM. And also don't forget to subscribe for more website optimization content. So let's dive in. And let's start with the why. You should always start with the why, right? Well, it's simple. With Google Tag Manager or any other tag manager solution, you're able to separate deployment of your website code from deployment of your marketing tags. And that should make a lot of marketing people happy because they no longer need to wait for deployment of their tags. But if you're a developer or a person who pushes those tags to the website, adds them to the template files, it should put a smile on your face as well, because with Google Tag Manager, all the tags will be displayed in one page in Google Tag Manager user interface rather than scattered across your template files. So what exactly is a tag in Google Tag Manager? Well, a tag is nothing more than a snippet of code provided by analytics or marketing or customer support vendors that help you integrate their services into your website. Nothing more than that. With Google Tag Manager, you no longer need to add those snippets of code directly to your template files. You can just add them to your Google Tag Manager container. So how it works is you copy the code for your Google Tag Manager container and add that to your website, and that one snippet of code loads all the other snippets of code. It's pretty neat and a lot cleaner than having everything in your template files. Google Tag Manager natively supports many Google and third-party tags as tag configurations. So if you want to add Google Analytics to your website, you just need to copy your property ID and enter it in the settings field for that tag in Google Tag Manager. And if a tag is not natively supported, you can probably find it in the community template gallery. If it's missing there as well, you can just add it as a custom HTML tag in Google Tag Manager. But before a tag can load, you need to give it a trigger. In Google Tag Manager, a trigger is what listens to certain events in the page. Things like form submissions, button clicks, scrolls, and a bunch of others. The trigger tells the tag to fire or load when something has happened in the page. In order to fire, every tag must have at least one trigger assigned to it, or it will just be sitting there waiting and nothing will be happening to it. So there are 4 types of triggers in Google Tag Manager, and let's look at each one of them. They're page view triggers, click triggers, user engagement triggers, and creatively other triggers. And now let's go through each type and see what they contain. First, let's have a look at the page view triggers. As the name suggests, this is what happens when a page is being viewed. There are 3 different page view triggers depending on when they fire during the page load. So the first one is page view, which is what happens when the Google Tag Manager container is loaded. Next up is the DOM ready trigger, which is when the browser has compiled the document. And finally, there's the window loaded trigger, which is when the page and all of its assets have fully loaded. You will almost never use Google Tag Manager without at least one page view trigger. Most third-party scripts like Google Analytics are fired using one of these triggers. You want them to load in every page whenever there's a page view, so you can capture those. Most commonly, you'll use the page view trigger, the first one when the container is loaded, but sometimes you need to wait for the page to be ready so you can analyze some elements in the page and read something from the page. This is when you'll use DOM ready or window loaded triggers instead. Moving on to click triggers, there are 2 different kinds of those in Google Tag Manager. All elements click trigger and just links click trigger. It's obvious. All elements will fire when any element is clicked, and the just links trigger will fire when a link is clicked in the page. You will often use these to capture user interactions and measure them as events in Google Analytics or other analytics tools. Next up, we have user engagement triggers, and those are element visibility triggers for when an element of the page becomes visible, form submission triggers, scroll depth, and YouTube video interaction triggers. And finally, There's other triggers for things like custom event triggers. This is used for data layer events, which is very, very powerful. And I will get to this later when I talk about the data layer. History change for working with browser history changes, JavaScript error triggers, and timer triggers. And having so many triggers is great, but often you don't want to load a tag every time a trigger is supposed to fire. So you don't want to load it on every single page view. You want to restrict only to a certain subset of pages. And for that, you need to use a trigger filter. Every trigger you have, you can set it to fire every time an event happens, event like page view or event like click, or only if one or more conditions are met. And conditions are something you define. A condition is configured to check a value of a variable. For example, you may want to fire a tag only if the page path contains products, that string products. So you can only fire it on product pages. You can use built-in or user-defined variables to define when a trigger will fire. And in the example I mentioned, page path is a built-in variable and you just want to check if it contains products. So let's talk about variables in more detail. They're almost the same as variables in programming. A variable can be static or dynamic, and there are built-in variables and user-defined variables in Google Tag Manager. Before you try to define your own or a user-defined variable, check if a built-in version of it exists. You need to go to the variables page, then click configure at the top and see if the variable you need is there but not enabled. User-defined variables are really where things get interesting in Google Tag Manager. There are many different types of user-defined variables, and while it's definitely worth exploring all of them, let's focus on the 3 you will most frequently use. First up is the custom JavaScript variable. You can run literally any JavaScript code here. If you want to grab an element value from the page or do some calculations around it, anything that you can do with JavaScript, you can do it here. So you just write a function that returns a value, and that's your custom JavaScript variable. And check this out, you can even use other variables inside a custom JavaScript variable. Next up is the data layer variable. This extracts value of a variable defined in the data layer, and again, more on this later in the video. And the last one I want to mention is the JavaScript variable, which is just a global variable defined in the page, a global JavaScript variable. So if you're doing anything that goes beyond a very, very basic Google Tag Manager setup, you're very likely to use custom JavaScript and data layer variables, and frequently. And now finally, let's talk about the data layer. It does sound abstract, I know, but it's actually very simple. Data layer is a JavaScript object that is used to pass the information from your website to Google Tag Manager container, nothing more than that. You can then use that information to populate variables and activate triggers in your tag configurations. To set up your data layer, you just initiate it as an empty array or an array with some values in it before loading your Google Tag Manager container. And if you define some values here, they will be available to you in the pageview triggers and all the tags that use pageview triggers to load. Google Tag Manager provides a special data layer variable called event. You can push an event into data layer without any context like this, or you can provide one or more variables with a push like this. Doing something like that will fire a custom event trigger I mentioned earlier. And to listen to this specific event called customize product from this example, you need to set up a custom event trigger and set event name to customize product. And then any additional variables you have defined in the data layer push will be available to you in Google Tag Manager as data layer variables. You need to set them up, of course. You can then use these variables in your tags, for example, a Google Analytics event tag. Data layer is one of the most powerful things in Google Tag Manager. It's what sits between your website and Google Tag Manager container. The most accurate way to pass information from the website to your container, either on initial page load or later when any user interaction happens, is by pushing that information into data layer. And that is all you need to know to get started. Tags are snippets of code you want to load in your pages. Triggers are rules that determine when a tag should be loaded. Variables are, well, variables, and data layer is the way for your website to send data to Google Tag Manager. If you're thinking about getting started with Google Tag Manager, I hope this video helps you. And I would love to know what held you back so far, so please comment below. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.